This is one of the rarest and most explosive weapons you can use as black against pawn to e4. It's called the Colorado Gambit, and if white's not careful, you can flip the board in your favor before move 10. Let's see how this chaos unfolds. We start off with pawn to e4. Black plays knight to c6, not the usual response, but it's setting a trap. White develops normally with knight to f3, and now the fireworks begin. Black plays pawn to f5, launching into the gambit right away. White takes the bait, capturing with pawn takes pawn. And black immediately hits the center with pawn to d5, offering activity instead of material. White supports the center with pawn to d4, but black isn't slowing down. Bishop jumps out to f5, recapturing the pawn and developing with tempo. White places bishop to b5, adding pressure to the knight. Black stays solid and plays pawn to e6, reinforcing the center and preparing smooth development. White now jumps the knight into the center with knight to e5, already eyeing the weak f7 square. But black calmly develops knight to e7, staying flexible and keeping options open. White goes for the pin with bishop to g5, locking down that knight. Black responds with queen to d6, holding everything together and ready to shift to the queenside if needed. White trades the bishop for the knight, bishop takes knight, and black recaptures with bishop takes bishop. White sees a chance and checks with queen to h5, but black has the perfect response, pawn to g6, calmly shutting down the pressure. White keeps poking with queen to h6, trying to stir up trouble on the dark squares. But black flips the switch, queen flies out to b4 with check, turning defense into offense. White blocks with knight to c3, but now black snatches the pawn on b2 with queen takes pawn, putting serious heat on the rook in the corner. White ignores it and castles kingside, a smart move to activate the rook and secure the king. But black continues the assault with queen takes knight on c3, grabbing more material and keeping pressure alive. White swings the queen to g7, trying to counterattack. But black defends perfectly with rook to f8, locking down the 7th rank and guarding key squares. White brings rook to b1 to apply some pressure back on the queen. But black has one more trick. Bishop captures on c2, and now black is up a piece and 2 pawns with strong control over the board. White followed natural moves, but black's activity and counterplay just overwhelmed them. That's the magic of the Colorado Gambit, rare, sharp, and deadly when used right. Here, what happens when white tries to hold onto the extra pawn? Most players think they're being clever, but the Colorado Gambit turns that stubbornness into chaos. Let's break it down. Now white tries to hold onto that pawn with pawn to g4, but this actually walks right into trouble. Black hits back immediately with pawn to h5, targeting the whole pawn chain and opening up the kingside. White brings the light-squared bishop out to h3 to support the pawns, but black goes ahead and captures with pawn takes pawn. White recaptures with bishop takes pawn, trying to hold the line, but black gets development and pressure with knight to f6, putting heat on the bishop. White jumps in with knight to g5, possibly eyeing some tactics near the king. Black keeps it cool with queen to d6, defending the knight and centralizing. White plays pawn to d4 to grab more space and lock the center. But now black goes in, knight captures bishop on g4, removing the attacker. White snaps back with queen takes knight, but now black hits with queen to f6, keeping the initiative alive. White tries to hold on to their pawn with knight to e6. Black takes it out immediately with bishop captures knight, keeping the board clean. White recaptures on e6 with pawn. Now black lifts the rook to h4, attacking the queen and getting ready to start putting pressure on white's kingside. White plays queen to g3, moving out of the rook's vision. But black responds perfectly. Queen takes pawn on e6 with check, grabbing the material and staying in control. White tucks the king away with king to f1 for safety. Black instantly plays rook to g4, attacking the queen and keeping activity on the board. White retreats the queen all the way to a3. And now black calmly captures with knight takes pawn on d4, picking up material and maintaining a grip on the center. White shifts the queen back to d3, trying to cover more ground. But black locks down the center with pawn to c5, and suddenly every piece is active and ready. White tried to hold onto that extra pawn, but it just gave black a faster attack. That's what makes the Colorado Gambit so dangerous. The initiative, the chaos, and the momentum are all in your hands. What happens if white doesn't take the pawn on f5 and just pushes instead? Well, the Colorado Gambit still gets spicy. White says no thanks and pushes forward with pawn to e5, trying to gain space. Black strikes back in the center with pawn to d6. White captures pawn takes pawn, and black immediately activates the queen with queen takes pawn. White builds the center with pawn to d4, and black hits back with pawn to e5, challenging the middle. White decides push the pawn to d5. Now black plays knight to b4 to attack the pawn and I-tactics. White defends with pawn to c4, holding strong. Then black launches pawn to e4, kicking white's knight and creating tension. White hops the knight to g5, eyeing some kingside mischief. Black calmly brings out the other knight to f6, covering the action and setting up for a flexible kingside. White brings in the second knight with knight to c3, adding more weight to the center. Black nudges pawn to h6, a simple "what's that knight doing?" move. White steps back with the knight to h3, keeping it on the board. Black doesn't slow down pawn to g5, building kingside pressure like a steamroller. White throws in pawn to a3, trying to chase away the knight. Black backs it up to a 6, keeping it safe for now. White continues expanding on the queenside with pawn to b4. Black answers right back with pawn to c5. This is officially a battle on both wings. White develops bishop to e2, looking to castle. Black drops bishop to d7, simple and solid, ready to link rooks. White castles kingside. Now black grabs the pawn on c5, pawn takes pawn. White recaptures with pawn takes pawn. Black says thank you and plays knight takes pawn, grabbing material and staying active. White plays bishop to e3, trying to catch up on development. Black fixes the structure with pawn to b6, reinforcing the knight and locking down the queenside. White plays rook to c1, eyeing that open file. Black answers with rook to c8, symmetry and tension building. White brings queen to d2, connecting the rooks and maybe dreaming of some tactics. Then black slides the dark squared bishop to g7, completing development and watching the long diagonal. White decides it's time to strike and plays pawn to f4. Black calmly captures pawn takes pawn. White recaptures with bishop takes pawn. And to wrap it all up, black castles kingside, tucking the king away and bringing the final rook into the game.